This week on The Wheelhouse. The manosphere. When podcasts prey on masculinity and the influence on politics. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. The 2024 election cycle was remarkable. Donald Trump, then the former president, was shot at a campaign rally. 8 days later, Joe Biden, the incumbent in the race, dropped out. Kamala Harris replaced Biden, and after Brad Summer, Harris met one watershed moment. A podcast interview that never happened. A week before the election, Harris' team couldn't agree with the producers of the Joe Rogan Experience on a time for the vice president to appear on the program. But Trump was on the show, and he ultimately won the election. This hour, we're asking how podcasts targeting young men, the so-called manosphere, influence gender politics, popular culture, and elections. As Democrats like Pete Buttigieg, Zohran Mamdani, and Texas congressional candidate James Tallarico line up for interviews on podcasts, we want to know, can the manosphere play a big role in November's midterms? Do you think it will? What podcasts do you listen to? Are they political? Hit us up on our YouTube stream or give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. We've got several guests on the show today to help us take a crack at the manosphere. Elena Moore is a reporter for NPR Washington's desk. You also might find her on Instagram modeling this NPR mini tote. Elena, thanks so much for being here.
Good morning. Happy to be back.
Happy to be back. Happy to be talking to you. Happy for what's going to be cherry blossom season in Washington, D.C., so enjoy yourself down there. Charlie Sabger is the director of the Young Men's Research Project. Charlie, great to have you on here.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on the show and excited to talk about your research. I want to set the groundwork here. It's really a wide-ranging conversation about masculinity, media, and politics. Elena, the manosphere has gotten a lot of attention in the past couple of years. We've talked about it a little bit on the show between us in the past, but let's talk about now its relevance to politics and why it sort of matters.
Well, yeah, I mean, it matters because in 2024, in the 2024 presidential election, we saw both Republicans and Democrats really make an effort to reach young voters. But on the right, President Trump, when then candidate Trump, really made a effort to zero in on young men. And he went on different, media, non-traditional media platforms that young men frequently congregate on and that are popular, whether that was specific podcasts, teaming up with streamers on different programs, meeting with just really, prominent influencers. And I think going to that space, we've seen meant a lot. But it was also, of course, talking about issues that were front of mind for a lot of these people. So that's why this is still such a big topic, because we saw politicians, when they do engage with this group, it can make a difference.
When I'm thinking about the manosphere here, I'm thinking in particular about my brain going to Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn. Can you talk about the podcasters, Charlie, maybe about their shows and maybe even the ideas that they share? Sort of take us through the spectrum here.
Sure. Yeah, it is a spectrum. I think that's a good word for it. Like any generation, like any part of media, every show is different, and we shouldn't, lump them all as homogenous necessarily. But yeah, they have very maybe overlaps in audience, I think is a good way to put it. But some of these shows do have kind of different missions. I mean, I think about someone like Joe Rogan, as you said, or the comedians Theo Vaughn, Andrew Schultz. They all have very popular podcasts with predominantly young male listeners that range on partisan identification. But, those shows are places that I think would be often described as first and foremost culture shows. And I think part of the reason it was so striking that Trump went on those programs is because he was able to capitalize on a changing political culture where politics may feel a little less forcibly coming up. It just kind of naturally comes up in what they're, in what these hosts are talking about. And many of these hosts talked about feeling in some ways pushed away or alienated from the Democratic Party. And that's something that we now know and is something that a lot of young men felt and a lot of young people young women and young men. So I would put those guys in a political culture space, this kind of apolitical turned more political, looking to be engaged with. But we can talk more about that. That space is also kind of a volatile one. It doesn't necessarily inherently mean party loyalty. But then I would also say there is a space targeting young men that is way more overtly partisan. And I would put that in, the late right-wing activist Charlie Kirk, his show, The Charlie Kirk Show, which is continuing to stream every day. Other programs, Tucker Carlson's show. I would say there are shows that do really center on politics. And I think that is a different space than maybe some of the more traditional manosphere. And then you have another space that people would consider far right, that has more extremist views in the spectrum here that we're talking about. Someone like Nick Fuentes, who obviously has an extremely controversial background. He's, a Holocaust denier. He's made really misogynistic comments. And I would put him in a completely different category. So this is a huge space of younger men and shows that are appealing to younger men. But that's why we have to talk about it.
And I think it sounds like the spectrum here goes from more subliminal sort of political messaging to that more overt, it sounds like you're saying. And young men, I think you said this earlier, are part of a traditional demographic here that doesn't necessarily vote as much. It's called low propensity voters. They might not necessarily turn out in huge numbers. Exit polls showed that Donald Trump won them over in 2024. One analysis I saw that was featured in Time was something like 54% of the vote share in the 18 to 29 demographic of young men went for Donald Trump. What part of their message were they drawn to, Elena? And then help me understand if you've sort of been able to do that autopsy and you have some maybe better numbers or more exact numbers here.
I wish I had, updated data I could just refresh every day. But no, I think we saw this shift to the right among young men, more pronounced. Obviously, there's been a growing gender divide with young women. And we should say that's roughly, voters under 30. When you look at exit polls, that's kind of what that means. So mostly Gen Z, a little bit of the young millennials, cuspers. When I was out covering the 2024 election and talking to people around the country, it was the issue that you hear from a lot of generations, economic strife. But I do think there is a unique economic connection that a lot of young people feel. They feel that a lot of, the traditional milestones that were promised to them and maybe they saw their parents and grandparents achieve are not attainable anymore. And I think that's something that really has resonated with a lot of young men. I've talked to researchers and pollsters who say, as they went out and talked to people, there's this sense of feeling like you have to kind of step up and have the success your parents did. And if you can't, that's a painful personal reality. So I think that economic message really drove a lot of people. And that's something Trump directly talked about. It was something we didn't see, obviously the Harris campaign did talk about the economy and did, have a platform there, but I don't think it resonated the same way as Trump, who really simplified that message to say things are too expensive. I'm going to make jobs more, plentiful. I'm going to make things more affordable. I'm going to bring prices down. I'm going to bring gas prices down. And I think that really resonated. And the other thing I'll say is I think a portion of the youth base, both genders, felt left behind by both political parties here. And I think young men especially have been feeling more and more pushed away and less connected to this party. And something that my team often thinks about is this seems to be a generation and maybe a subgeneration, of young men who, when they are engaged and when they are listened to, they can be very engaged. But if they are not listened to and they're not sought out, they can be tuned out. And I think that that's something we saw in 2024. And I don't want to overblow Trump's, overhype his going on into these traditional spaces, because I think, to your point, a big part of this was just emphasizing the issues that they care about.
Charlie, do me a favor here and tell me about the work that your group does, the Young Men Research Project. Tell me about the work that they do before I ask you about these surveys. And tell me what your role is.
Sure. So I'm the director of Young Men Research Project, which is a nonprofit research organization that was started in spring 2024 with the goal of first just better understanding what's actually happening with this demographic. For a while, young men have kind of been overlooked in terms of, zeroing in on them specifically to see what their political, social, digital trends are. For a while, young men have been grouped together with young women. Gen Z has kind of been treated as a monolith. And I think as the 2024 election really showed, that's a huge mistake. Young men and women were more divided than any other demographic this past election. There was a 17-point difference in Democratic support. And so there's clearly a long way to go in understanding what this demographic is actually thinking about in terms of their preferred policies, messages, candidates, et cetera. And so our group, we do a mix of analysis. Our main product, you could say, is we do polling in collaboration with YouGov, nationally representative surveys of 18 to 29-year-old men. And we'll ask a range of questions from their top issues to how they think about masculinity today, to the ways that they engage in civic life. And so we do polling, but we also do regular analysis of young men's online world and try to work with pro-democracy, pro-equality organizations to better understand and engage this demographic.
Tell me about these three surveys here. Tell me a little bit about them, your insights, and then maybe some top issues that kind of popped up as a result.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we do these nationally representative online surveys of 18 to 29-year-old men. The first one was ahead of the 2024 election. And since then, we've done one in May 2025. And then our last survey was October 2025. Like I said, we kind of run the gamut in terms of what we survey young men about, but we generally ask what are their top issues, as Elena alluded to, time and time again. Inflation, cost of housing, these are 1 and 2. Social issues tend to rank more towards the bottom. Crime and immigration kind of become more salient for Trump voters. Democracy, climate change, more for Democrats and left-leaning young men. But like I said, inflation, cost of living, the bread and butter issues, that's still what dominates young men's issue priorities. But we've also asked some really interesting questions about dating, masculinity. We do a grid typically on questions related to sexism, racism, and some other things. But there's a lot more I can go into.
There is going to be something I want to bookmark here and talk about later, because I'm going to play a clip for you later today that gets on this issue. But Elena, the idea in the 2024 election, at least, was that, as you're talking about Charlie highlighting this, and he's not saying this, but this is what some of the people that they're surveying are saying, is Trump, they think in the calculus and voting for Trump in 2024 is that he's going to, for some reason, be able to handle these economic issues, where this woman, Kamala Harris, might not necessarily be able to address them. Is that what I'm understanding here? And by the way, they're going to think that this candidate here on the other side is more going to be aligned with thinking about social issues. Is that what some of these survey results tell you? Or am I just super generalizing here?
Are you saying there was a gender dynamic or a gender appeal in the candidates?
Yeah, so
options?
At least so if you're thinking here that these young men that are being surveyed here, they're talking about inflation and social issues. Some of the tape that we're going to hear later is going to say, hey, just because you may be concerned about inflation and the economy doesn't mean that this one candidate can't handle it and the other one can. Did that happen a lot in the 2024 election, I guess, where these voters are thinking that one candidate may be able to tackle the economy more than the other one, and they might not necessarily be right in that assumption?
Well, I think there's always a sense of, what a candidate's platform is not what necessarily translates to the message that voters feel they're hearing. And I think that was a huge issue throughout both former President Joe Biden's administration, his campaign, and then former Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign. Was they were preaching and pushing a slew of different messages and or policies and different areas of focus, including on the economy, touting wins of the administration. But the key here is that that did not resonate. And so to your question of why, I mean, I don't think we can know for certain how the dynamics of candidates' gender or, just larger identity play into that. But I think what we can say is that Trump in some ways said the quiet part out loud. He just really leaned into this idea that, young men shouldn't be forgotten. He has repeatedly highlighted, he was often highlighting young men like Charlie Kirk or, his son, Don Jr. He picked a young man for his vice presidential candidate, his running mate, Vice President J.D. Vance. And so I think it's just a space where you could argue young men saw themselves more. But I think that we have to, continue to monitor people's feelings on candidate, qualifications, because as we can see, looking at past candidates, it's less about your qualification and more about how you resonate with people.
Yeah, and I should say this better in this regard. Much of what was made in terms of the rhetoric, and you talked about saying the quiet part out loud, a lot was made on the right, and we heard this in local interviews as well, where they're equating Kamala Harris, because of her skin color and her gender, as being a DEI candidate. That was something that they would say out loud too. So there's this effort, maybe at least on the right, where they're trying to align Kamala Harris with social issues and then Trump with the economy. Is that something that could be why we're seeing these survey results be so skewed, folks?
We definitely saw a push on social issues and as a negative for Kamala Harris. I mean, one of the most remember the ads people remember a lot was that ad that ran in swing states around the country of Kamala Harris is for they, them, seeming to imply, her views on transgender rights. And I would say that there is this, in addition to that economic strife, and I admit it's more something I've seen from, young, either public figures who have large audiences that are young men or just younger, right wing figures like Charlie Kirk. But there was this real, push to talk more about social conservative values, whether that be, pushing back on so-called, DEI measures and really trying to kind of villainize that effort and calling it in some ways, they would argue, discriminatory towards maybe white people, men. I think that's something we did see some of these podcasters, influencers kind of glom onto. And same with this rhetoric around specifically transgender Americans and their rights to healthcare and to be in certain spaces. I think that was something you hear some of these figures like Joe Rogan talk about. It's something he still talks about. And so there is this sense of Trump connecting with some within this group on these, maybe you could call culture war issues.
Charlie, you mentioned that young men, and this was in a pre-interview with the outstanding Wheelhouse producer, Tale Ricketson, a low level of trust in mainstream media, but these voters seem to be politically curious. So in what capacity do these podcasts sort of fill the gap?
Sure. So we just got done doing a series of focus groups with a few different groups of young men. Some of them were Democrat leaning, some of them independents, and some of them low engagement. And of course, there were differences across them when we got into politics, but one of the common threads was, in fact, this very low level of trust in the establishment. And I think when you are saying the establishment, you have to think about the two parties, but also the media, journalists, really everything that people group together as part of this kind of Washington apparatus. And so I think the podcasts play this role that we're seeing where, in and of themselves, Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, Andrew Schultz, these guys have massive platforms and, they reach millions. I think they also serve as proxies in terms of kind of representing the median young man voter, which is to say someone who is less ideologically rigid, more politically independent. They kind of have a gag reflex to cancel culture, but they also are not very hardline one way or the other down the policy docket. And so Joe Rogan, for example, gave Bernie Sanders an endorsement ahead of the 2020 election. Zoran Mamdani went on flagrant with Andrew Schultz ahead of his mayoral campaign, and they were quite visibly taken by him. And I think the general theme you'll see is that these very anti-establishment candidates succeed on these platforms, and they also succeed with young men because the reality is that the status quo and the two-party system, people who kind of represent this more just very, traditional Washington ethos, just it isn't popular. And so Bernie Sanders, in fact, is the most popular politician that we find among young men, and it's not even close. And I would also note that among Trump voting young men, he's net favorable.
Yeah, and one way we'll hear it later on in a clip in the show is that some might refer to somebody who's sort of anti-establishment as a political desperado. More on that later. Just want to tell folks they can give us a call, 888-720-9677 if they want to join the conversation today, 888-720-9677. They're political, Elena, at least some of these hosts, right? I mean, they say they're not, but there's some element of politics in here.
Yeah, well, I think we're in a time where it's pretty hard to avoid politics, especially if you are a digitally, reliant person. If you're on social media a lot, I think we've been talking about this for years now, that I think this is a generation that has had to confront a lot of political issues, whether they like it or not, and whether that be seeing with their own eyes on their phones the destruction in Gaza, to the violence going on now between Iran and its neighbors in the U.S. and Israel, to just this influx of content about politics from both sides of the aisle and somewhere in the middle. But I also think it's just become a lot more common to talk about this idea, as Charlie said, of distrusting the system and the two parties. And I cannot tell you how many times I heard on the campaign trail, lesser of two evils. If when I said, who are you feeling, Trump or Harris? If I had a nickel for every time I heard that phrase, I could quit my job and just buy a beach house. And so I would say that, there's this real, it's almost like a third, I wouldn't call it independent, because it's like this third space where you're not aligned with one of these parties. You're really focused on issues, and you're willing to kind of cross the party that you voted for in an election if they don't align with those issues. And I think that's a very unique thing to younger voters. And it's something we see on both sides of the aisle. They're willing to call out the party they may more likely identify with if it crosses something that they believe is a core to their politics.
Just as my friends at NPR are trying to popularize the tote bag, the mini tote bag, I'm trying to bring this into the equation, what I call the Jelly Roll quotient, because Jelly Roll says that he's not political. Yet, pretty much to live nowadays is, as you said, it's pretty hard to avoid politics at the time. And I kind of want to get to this because I bet that the listener is wondering, like, where we're going to close the loop on this, but it's sort of, because we're seeing this now, right? Going back to some of the tape, right? It's so easy to say something nowadays and you think it gets lost in the ether, but it's recorded. It's part of the record now more than ever. So a lot of these folks that are saying, hey, we said something about Trump a couple of years ago. I don't know if we feel that way now. Some of that, and at the time saying that you're not political, some of that messaging is sort of evading responsibility in some way. It's sort of giving yourself that option, an out, if you will, to opt out and say, hey, I'm not a part of that. That's happening over there, but I'm not there, right? Do you see some of that in this generation, or is this something that transcends the generation?
Well, I think it's just
something we've always done.
I think it's a really hard thing to kind of pinpoint and describe, like, put in traditional political context, because this generation breaks with a lot and is and wants to break with more political norms. And so, yeah, you would think that if you hear a lot of people criticizing, a policy or an action from one side of this political spectrum, you'd be like, oh, they're moving away. And in some ways that's true, but I also think this is a generation that, because they've been exposed to so much, are almost pragmatic in some ways. I can't tell you how many young people I spoke with on both sides of the aisle who said, I don't love everything about this candidate, but I know where I have to vote. But then I also spoke to some people who said, neither of these people are pushing me, and I'm probably going to sit it out. And I think that that's a hard thing, I think, for maybe us in the political world, in the newsroom, to sometimes fully comprehend, because that idea of almost being not a free agent, but willing to sit it out unless otherwise told, like compelled to stand up. And I think that that's been something really fascinating to see from some of these influencers and podcasters. I think that that's on full display. I mean, you look at someone like Joe Rogan, who obviously has been podcasting for years and years and years, and you watched him slowly move to the right. But even now, he'll criticize Trump, and then he'll still say something that aligns with Trump's values and his platform. So it's just really not clear cut.
And this is very important too. And we're supposed to go to a break, but I want to stay on this thread for a second, because we're celebrating National Women's Month with quite the fury here at Connecticut Public over the next couple of weeks. As while we're presenting the Manosphere this week, next week we're going to be talking about incel culture and how that language sort of permeates the political domain. And it's fascinating because I'm not necessarily asking you from a generational standpoint why folks are saying the things that they do and then maybe evading responsibility. Part of the point I'm trying to make is that, so we're talking about Gen Z here and young men, but Joe Rogan ain't in Gen Z, and he's hosting the show. Theo Vaughn ain't in Gen Z. There are a lot of these folks. And I don't even think Charlie Kirk. I think Charlie Kirk was more of a cusper, and he might even be a millennial at this point. But the point is that, or was a millennial. But the point is that that we're sort of seeing a lot of influence in this culture, in this alt-right space, so to speak, being influenced by Gen X and some millennials.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it alt-right. But yes, that the alternative media space. And yeah, a lot of these figures are speaking to a younger,
Ultra-right,
like an
sorry.
audience, a younger audience than they themselves are. And I mean, in some ways, that's not that uncommon, even on the left. I mean, from Bernie Sanders to Zohran Mamdani, none of these figures are. There are very few Gen Z voices who are either eligible to be in office, have such a big platform yet, but those voices are on the rise. There are a lot of budding Gen Z creators and influencers who are kind of talking similar ways and trying to do similar platforms. But I hear what you're saying on that. It is a confusing message to hear them saying one thing and then almost kind of stepping back when things get a little hairy.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're talking with Charlie Sabger and Elena Moore about podcasting, young men, and the manosphere coming up. How are black men doing in this space? Charlie and Elena are going to be joined by Washington Post columnist Theodore R. Johnson as we discuss how candidates are or are not reaching out to black voters and the men inside a black manosphere, if it exists. And you can join the conversation by hitting us up on our YouTube stream or calling us now, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. You're in the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're talking today about young men, podcasts, and politics. What does it mean to be a man? How are black men doing in the online manosphere where politics and podcasts intersect? Is there a black manosphere? And are more black men voting MAGA? These are questions I want to explore with Theodore R. Johnson, a columnist at The Washington Post. Ted, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Very happy to have you on. Elena Moore, a reporter on NPR's Washington desk. She's still with us. And Charlie Sabger, the director of the Young Men's Research Project. Charlie, thanks so much for staying on here. We hope that folks will join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. Be comfortable to talk to us here today about race and gender dynamics and about democracy, 888-720-9677. Ted, we're going to go back to 2024. Elena and Charlie talked about how Trump was able to win over young men, but he also made inroads with young black voters, or at least they're saying that about 3 in 10 black men under 45 voted for Trump, according to the Associated Press. Is there a shift? Is there something where, sort of as there's forensic studies being done on elections, we want to blame somebody, so we're comfortable blaming people of color on things like this? What do you think?
Yeah, it's so we'll see. My sense of it is that the shift, to the extent that it happened, is not sticky for the Republican Party. It's particular to Trump, and there's a few things happening that have sort of led us to this point. The first thing is Trump won about 15% of black voters in this past election, which is the highest total in nearly 6 decades for a Republican presidential nominee. So it's not nothing, even though it's still very small relative to the number of black folks that voted for Democrats. It's significant. The second thing is most of the black folks voting for him, as you mentioned, were younger and were male. The Black America, I should say, is more diverse than it has ever been in terms of nation of origin. So many black folks under 40 in particular, first, second generation black Americans, are descended from black people in the Caribbean or sub-Saharan Africa. So the connection, the historical connection to Jim Crow, to a sort of anti-Civil Rights Act Republican Party doesn't exist the same for younger black folks as it does for older ones. And then there's Trump himself, who his sort of brand of machismo and sort of being able to do whatever he wants without being held accountable and still, being rich, sort of pitching himself as a playboy. That also is an attractive feature for many young men. Those things came together at a time where he was running against a woman for the presidency, and I think that speaks a lot to how he did with black voters last year. The polls are to be believed, though. He's bled a lot of the support that he gained leading up to the election.
In the last couple of years, can you take us into a black manosphere, if it exists, and telling us maybe how it's evolved over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'll tell you, the studies and research on the Black manosphere distinctly it's still happening, still being collected, even on the manosphere generally. So what I will say is, one, that the manosphere is more multiracial than we might assume. And when I'm Gen X, if the manosphere had popped up in the 1980s, it probably would have had a segregated section. There would have been like the black version, the white version. It wouldn't have been as multiracial integrated as the current version is. And I think social media, as well as just a more diverse country, has contributed to that. But there is still a very distinct version or expression of the manosphere within Black America. I think two of its features are its relationship to women and its sort of view of what a man is supposed to be in the world. So less of an incel culture in Black the manosphere, more of like a passport bros culture. Passport bros is this sort of it's a term that describes Black men who will fly overseas to other nations to have sex with women, to date women, to maybe bring a wife back to the States, in the belief that America American women, and particularly Black American women, aren't suitable mates as they used to be before because of they don't adhere to traditional gender norms or view masculinity the same. And so it's almost hyper masculine and hypersexualized, and more social and not asexual or incel, and sort of confined to to social media and podcast space. It's certainly more physical. The other thing is, in the way they relate to it, the Black manosphere is sort of intra community looking, so it looks into Black America rather than the role of Black men in the world, and so it's sort of a view of what the Black man is supposed to be in the Black community, and less what a man is supposed to be in the world, and much less a man that just happens to be Black. So it's the racial part of the Black manosphere plays a central role in its expression, and not is not just an adjective for the look of the people participating in the manosphere.
That's very interesting the way that you put that. I appreciate that perspective. The Public Religion Research Institute, a non-profit research organization, found that in 2024, 40% of young women identified as religiously unaffiliated compared to 36% of young men. How does this square, Charlie, with political messages and with podcasts many young men are listening to? So how is religion sort of coming up in these surveys?
Yeah, so I think first I would note that there's been a lot of discourse recently about young men flocking back to church and this kind of unprecedented revival. And what we found and what the researchers have found is that generally this has kind of been debunked, that the truth with Gen Z is that young men and women are now attending church about at the same level, which is unique in that every other demographic, women far outpace men in going back to church. And so I think it's important to keep that context. That said, if you listen to the messaging of groups like Turning Point, and really just the entire conservative movement, they are very clear in their prescriptions to young men in that you should get a job, go to church, get married, have kids, and that's pretty much all you need to be happy and to live a successful life. Meanwhile, on the left, I think it goes without saying that that message really hasn't really been the message that young men are hearing for a while. And the polling certainly shows that young men who are most devoted, who go to church every week or more, disproportionately skew conservative and Trump leaning. And so this obviously has a bunch of different causes for how politics, social views play out and whatnot. But in terms of, I think, the messaging you hear online, it is true that groups like Turning Point, but also less explicitly political messengers, do often tell young men to go to church, pray. This is the way to find meaning in an age where everything else seems so chaotic.
Earlier, we heard from Ted saying that polls may be showing that support for Trump is sort of bleeding at this time. So now we're going to go to Elena, and let's hear at least any kind of evidence you might have there. What are you seeing in terms of your reporting, whether or not that's actually happening?
I think you have to look back at the issues that really galvanized young men to vote or stay home. I mean, we've talked about the economy. Obviously, there's still a lot of concern around affordability, high prices, a lot of just economic uncertainty about the future. But I would also add two other issues that I think we've seen galvanize people, at least, in online spaces, but also I hear it does come up in focus groups and in the field, which is this idea of rooting out corruption and specifically how the administration has handled the federal investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. And I think that has been a real sore spot for a lot of voters who felt that Trump and many of his key allies had promised to bring answers on this convicted sex offenders' ties to powerful people and have felt unsatisfied by that. And we've heard that from some more libertarian Republicans who have really been celebrated in some of these manosphere spaces, you could say, going on some of these shows. And then the other issue I would say is obviously, international conflicts and war. I think that is something we've seen really, fire up a lot of young people across the political spectrum. But Trump campaigned on, no endless wars. And a lot of young people really have this desire to have a president who focuses on domestic issues. I mean, it gets back to that America First idea that Trump ran on. And I think we are seeing and have heard from people a big kind of disconnect on that, and or feeling like they were told one thing but are hearing another by seeing the unfolding war in Iran, and obviously some of the United States' other military interventions over the last year.
Ted, are you seeing numbers that show that some of this historic support that Republicans got from black men in America in 2024 is changing?
Yes, absolutely. Leading up to the election, I'm going to fudge the numbers a little bit, but it'll be in the ballpark. I want to say something like 30 something percent of black voters were at least willing to give Trump a look. And shortly after his election, that number ticked up in job approval for Trump. In the latest YouGov poll I saw from last week, approval ratings for Trump among Black Americans is at 7%. So it is not only leaking, it is basically falling back to levels that Republicans saw during the Obama years. Why? Black unemployment is up. It's almost near recession levels. If this were national, it's almost at 7.5%. Wars, we know who pays the price for when the country goes to war. It's usually young men, and sort of historically and maybe even stereotypically, usually young men of color are the ones that are in the front lines or seem to or perceived to be in the most danger. While many black voters and young black men in particular supported Trump's immigration policy, they see in some communities immigrants as being labor competition. None of them signed up for immigration agents shooting U.S. citizens. And so the execution of even favorable policy, DEI is included, immigration, has turned them off to Trump's ability to deliver on these promises. And even basic wealth building things like home ownership, small business creation for young black men are certainly not what Trump promised and have taken a hit since last year. So if you were a black man, a young black man in particular, and voted for Trump, all of the things you voted for, he has not delivered on. And on top of that, the racially insensitive things he said, the sort of lack of belonging in the broader MAGA culture, there's nothing to keep you if the policy isn't delivering and you're still seen as sort of a sort of ostracized from the broader MAGA social cultural movement. There was no direction for his support to go among young black voters or black voters generally, but down given his performance over the last year.
There's a lot to talk about. I asked you earlier to bookmark this conversation that we were having about race and sexism and whether or not Kamala Harris could respond to certain issues. We're going to talk about it after this quick break. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Let's do a bit of a lightning segment here as we have just a few minutes left on the show this week because there's some very important clips that we want to play for you. Elena Moore is with us. We also have Charlie Sapker, and we have Theodore R. Johnson. Elena, I just want to spend some time on racism and sexism and how it may have impacted former Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign. During the campaign, Trump called Harris stupid or slow. And then there was this volley from Charlie Kirk.
Kamala Harris screams as somebody who has unaddressed, lingering father issues. By the way, you know her father does not like her and wasn't even at the convention? Her father's still alive. Somebody should go find her father and put him on camera. She always needs to have a man around. Willie Brown, Tim Walz. There's something unaddressed there. And that probably is the psychological root.
This content is super sensitive. It's downright inflammatory. However, we're playing it because this is what people are hearing. This is what the guys are hearing. And then they got to go ahead and go vote. So what's your reaction to that, what you just heard, Elena?
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, it's not a message that only young men were hearing. We know that Charlie Kirk actually had a very wide audience of on gender and age. So I would say that, yeah, he made a lot of comments about a lot of different, things, people that were seen as, everything from racist, sexist to just, things that made people feel incredibly taken aback and offended. I think that a lot of Charlie Kirk's comments have continued to surface following his assassination, and part of that is because he has been online for so long. But yeah, it's a message that I think embodies a sect of how people are feeling, but I do not think we should take what Charlie Kirk is saying has said as representation for a large swath of where this, a large portion of where young men are headed. I think that would be an oversimplification at this point, but it is striking, and it's something to keep in mind to see if we start hearing maybe younger conservatives who would say they were inspired by Charlie Kirk, if we start hearing them kind of champion, amplify similar rhetoric and push similar racist, arguably sexist statements like that, I think that is striking, but I think it might be a little too early or maybe too generalizing to take some of Kirk's statements and say it has driven further, sentiment among young men, because Kirk really did have a wider audience.
And then what I was trying to get to earlier when we were talking about the issues and how men are looking at these issues, at least 18 to 29-year-old men are looking at these issues. What we're going to hear, Ted, is a speech where we hear from Barack Obama. And earlier in this speech, before he says what he says in the clip, he talks about how it shouldn't just be assumed that if you're looking to vote on the economy, you should vote for Donald Trump. He asks you to consider Kamala Harris when you're thinking about economics. He's asking you to consider the work that the Biden administration did. And then he sort of talks directly to Latinos and black men, talking about real strength and what it is to be a man. Here it is.
And if any of you have a dad or an uncle or a coworker or a drinking buddy who says he's thinking about voting for Trump because he's tired of cancel culture, or because he's uncomfortable with Kamala's position on transgender issues, or because he just thinks that America needs a strong, tough leader who will get stuff done, you might want to ask them, with respect and with love, what evidence do we have that Donald Trump actually got stuff done? And since when exactly is Trump's trademark behavior, the boasting and the bullying and the selfishness and the cruelty, since when is that a sign of strength? That is not what real strength looks like, Milwaukee. It never has been. Real strength is about working hard and taking responsibility and telling the truth even when it's inconvenient.
That's what you hear from Barack Obama. What's your reaction, Ted Johnson?
Yeah, it's. I mean, this is Obama sort of in his typical lather. It's a good speech. It's a good call to action. But I think what it misses is that black men who voted for Trump were not looking for a role model. They were voted for Trump because one, they didn't trust a woman with the economy or with the military. That's sort of the very fringe element. The other part, I think, the more central claim was that the Democratic Party, they didn't feel like the party had delivered for them. These young black men, like Trump has been the standard bearer for the Republican Party for a decade. So, and in his first term, for all of his missteps, the economy, certainly leading up to COVID, wasn't that bad. And there's sort of a, remember 8 years ago when things were so much better, when we were in our, 20 or 15 or whatever, can't we get back to that instead of where we are with Biden? So there's that. And then the last thing is that for young black men willing to entertain Donald Trump, they have a view of masculinity that says men should be providers, protectors, and sort of have good standing, sort of be admired in the community. Nothing about good behavior is necessary for those three things to be true. And so there is a small segment, again, 4 in 5 black men still voted for Democrats, but that last bit there, that was not disqualifying for Trump, even for men who are seeking to sort of live out those qualities.
Charlie, we only got about 20 seconds to do this, but is there any evidence that these issues are changing over the vote totals here? Is it still inflation in the economy that young men care about?
Yes, it is. And in fact, recent polling is suggesting that Trump is very much underwater with this demographic on those key issues. And as healthcare premiums spike, as all these issues are becoming more salient, it's hurting even more.
Thank you, Charlie Sabger, who's with the Young Men Research Project, Elena Moore with NPR, and Ted Johnson from the Washington Post. Great context today. Thank you all for that. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you so much to our crew that produced this show. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.